Hi everyone, thank you for coming to my channel. If it's your first time here, my name's Lara, adoptee, adoption and wellbeing researcher, psychotherapist and coach. And today I'm talking about the inner world that we all have and the outer world in which we have to live. I started thinking about inner world versus outer world recently because we have this idea about our intuition, this idea that we have an inner voice and that it's something that we need to kind of listen to occasionally. And I guess largely it's that split between feelings, emotions, connecting with our own true selves versus the structure and the rules and the guidelines that are put in place by our families and by our friends and by society, and then obviously on a much more macro level, the governments and those that govern countries around the world. And in the work that I do and in my own life, I think is fair to say that often there's a conflict between what we believe is true for ourselves and the rules that society creates and those rules by which we feel that we need to abide. And I think it's very interesting to consider how this can make for quite a difficult emotional journey and creates conflict in many of us. By and large, systems and structures are put in place that ensure that society runs to the best of its ability well, that there's productivity, that kind of works along the lines of a reduction in crime rates, and that means that we are producing and that the economies are functioning and that kind of thing, and that we're trying to live at least to the best of our abilities in most places with a degree of freedom, although not in all places, but in most places, certainly in Western in the Western Hemisphere, with a degree of certain freedom, civil liberties, but also keeping things ticking over, and so therefore having to comply to certain rules and regulations. And so that kind of structure is macro, right down to the very sort of very kind of small level personal scale experience. And I think that's what I'm talking about here today. I've worked with many people over the years and spoken to them about their own inner world and how that is something that, for me as a therapist, it's kind of important to try and become aware of. Some people are more aware of themselves in terms of what feels right versus what feels wrong, what their thoughts are versus what the thoughts are of those around them, and how those might collide and create problems. And other people are less able to do that. That some people are less aware, let's say, of their own inner voice or their own intuition. I believe it's something that we can all develop. I believe it's something that we can work on and focus on, and certainly mindfulness practice and meditation and those kinds of practices and going inward, if you like, can enhance that skill and give us a better route to ourselves, if you like. I remember once working with a client who went to everybody for advice about what to do next. But the net result of that was that she just ended up very, very confused because, of course, nobody agrees with the next person. And so if you're somebody who has a very weak connection with your own inner voice and your own sense of what's right versus wrong, it can be problematic in your life. And so with this client in particular, I used to try and encourage her to listen to her own inner voice and to kind of tune into what felt right for her. And I think what we discovered was that she didn't trust herself, and she didn't trust whether she should listen to her own instinct and her own intuition, because decisions that she had made in the past had maybe led her to doing things that ended up being problematic or difficult situations that she had to get out of. in some way, I think those decisions and that journey through mistakes is really important to kind of leading us to a direction of knowing what's right and wrong. And arguably, those decisions that were made in the past were also not based on her own inner thoughts or her own values or thoughts or beliefs. Maybe those were based on what society had suggested that one would do. And a really clear example of that is, marriage, a job, 2.4 kids, or whatever the median is now. And I work with many people who feel that's just not for them. And one of the difficulties then is kind of mitigating that and kind of working out how to balance that sense of what's right or wrong for the self with the expectation of those around. And yeah, we see this a lot in TV programs and kind of dramas all the time. It's very difficult to exert your truth and to have the boundaries around your truth and to kind of follow your own path. It can be really, really challenging to do that. And actually, I believe more so if you're surrounded by people who are much more, let's call it, cognitive in their nature. Now, we all have cognition, we all have cognitive parts to our brain, but some people operate much more on that level than others. Some people are very logical and will kind of really look at facts and figures and not have any sense of feeling in terms of their decision making or in terms of the decision making. If they don't think about that for their own decisions, how it feels, they're certainly not going to be able to do that for another person. And so that if you are in a family like that, let's say, or if you have friends like that, or you're in some sort of a society or a job or an organization, again, I hear it a lot where there's a lot of mismatch in terms of ethical approach to things. It's really, really difficult to continue to be true to yourself when you're surrounded by a very powerful energy of this is what we do, this is what one should do. The shoulds and should nots of life are very often quite complicated and can be very damaging and can make us feel like we all have to get in line and do what everyone says we should do. And a lot of that's out of our power for sure, living in society, unless you opt out entirely, which a lot of people do because they just about had enough of living and dancing to everybody's tune. And that goes well for some and less well for others. But we have to comply to a point. So what's the difference between complying at a societal level with certain rules and regulations and trying to tune into what's right for you as an individual or on a more individual level? And I think it comes down to the level of well-being that we can achieve. So certain rules, they might be annoying. Certain regulations, particularly annoying. But living to someone else's expectation of your life, let's call it, as in terms of the path that you're going on, the expectation of you in terms of whether you're studying the right subject at university or whether you're expected to get married and have children. And there's a lot of negative narrative about that, those that dare to step out of that and say, well, that's not for me, I don't want to have children. There's that kind of, if not negative, there's like, oh, well, you'll grow out of it, that kind of an approach. I feel like that complying in those things that feel ultimately wrong, that feel like that's not who you are, is only going to end in trouble. Some of these things we can suppress. Some of these things we can avoid and ignore for a while. But the closer that we get to understanding ourselves, the closer that we get to tuning in with what feels right for ourselves, the harder that becomes to ignore. And I think the more difficult it becomes to achieve well-being. And so this is when, and we often see, that as we go through life and we get a bit older, again, that sort of existential thing comes in, life is kind of running out, let's call it. And so it's now, I have to live true to myself now, it's now or never, that we can be a bit stronger with our boundaries. And I feel that we tune in more to our inner voice And it seems like that's something that feels like we have no choice but to do sometimes. Is it the easy option? Well, no, of course. We see that all the time. People that choose to live a life that's less conventional in the eyes of those around them have particular issues that they have to battle with. They have arguments and conflict with people who won't see their point of view. But is it right for them to live their lives that way? 100% it is. There's no other way to live other than that which is true to yourself. So obviously a disclaimer around that is that I always believe we should all do what feels right to us, unless it's inflicting pain or suffering on another person, and or unless that other person is consenting. That for me that's kind of my benchmark in terms of judging or kind of evaluating what we should be doing in terms of our life. But if you are just following your intuition, which is not to conform, not to comply, and to do certain things that feel difficult or are seen as being problematic by others, then kind of that's just the way the world is. And I feel that we have to be true to ourselves. We have to follow that voice. We have no choice in the end. I guess I feel that, as I said previously, I think that's something that gets stronger as we go through life, because figuring out what feels right to us is also kind of dependent on experiencing that which feels wrong to us. You can't know what you don't like unless you've sampled it and tried it. And so we can't magically know, certainly within this physical realm, within this physical dimension in the world in which we live that's very structured, we can't know what doesn't suit us in many ways until we've actually done it. And I guess I'm talking about things like jobs or where to live or expectation in society, that kind of a thing. Other things are much more internal, that we're born with a kind of a knowing. And I feel like that experiences that exclude that reality can kind of heighten that, if that makes sense. It can shine a light on that for ourselves, that it kind of maybe lies dormant until there's a situation which really highlights that is something that we have to act on at some point. And also sometimes we can't act on those things immediately, and to do that we have to square that circle for ourselves. We have to kind of be able to justify why we're not doing it right now. But I always say with people, if you're not doing it right now, that's okay, as long as you're aware that that's something that you have to do because there's a gain in some other part of your life. And that might be financial, let's say, staying in a job you hate, but you have to do that right now in order to keep a roof over your head, in full knowledge that that's why you're doing it. I always say, let's just not do things in a space of denial. Let's just do things understanding why we're doing them and the reasons why we're doing that for now, knowing that if we could, we'd change it, or that when the time comes that we can change it, we will change it. So it's tuning in with your own truth. And I feel the braver we get, the more courageous that we get, the older we get. And I guess the reminders that we have in the world, I've seen with a lot of people over the last 18 months that, the pandemic has really had people stop and think about the lives they're living and whether those lives are true to the people that they are. And very many people have stepped off, let's say, that hamster wheel and made change in their life, that they were driven to do that in that moment. And I think the circumstances made that more possible for people. But sometimes we just have to step up and stand up and say, this is who I am and this is what I'm going to do. So inner world versus outer world, and how those two sometimes collide, and the tools that we can create and get better at, that now allow us to find our inner voice, to exert ourselves, and to be more boundaried about what feels right and what feels wrong. I hope this has made some sense and has resonated on some level. I'll be very keen, obviously, to hear your feedback on that and your thoughts around that. But it is a topic that comes up a lot in my work with clients. It's the inner conflict that we feel between what we feel and what we are expected to do. And yeah, it can be a big problem. First of all, getting to understand yourself, understanding what that inner voice is telling you versus what the outer world is demanding. So thanks for listening. Thank you for coming to my channel, and please like, subscribe, and I shall be back again with more. Thank you.